I am not used to people not being able to hear me. I'm loud by nature. Guys, I had a hard time sitting in my seat in that barnyard song. How about you guys? It was so fun. The kids loved it all week. And I'm telling you, if you've not worked VBS or in children's ministry, you are missing out. It was such a good week. And I love it. Kids are so honest. I have a bum knee. And I sat down with my girls, Molly and Katie, and they were at crafts, and I was talking about my bum knee, and I said, they went to different schools, and Molly's here this morning, but Katie's not here, and neither one of them had been coming here regularly. And I said, did you guys know each other before this? And they said, yeah, we met at Camp Invention. And I said, well, what's that? What'd you invent? And Molly told me that she invented a button where you could press it and think about what age you wanted to be, and you would go back to that time. And Katie said, yeah, and I think you could use that. So if you want to know something about yourself, they're going to tell you. So this morning, guys, I just want to talk to you a little bit about investing in our children. Um, we're going to start off in Daniel. We're going to talk a little bit about Daniel. We're going to talk a little bit about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We're going to talk a little bit about David and maybe even throw a couple others in there. But I'm going to set this up a little bit. There was a war, okay? And there was a war between Babylon and Israel, and Babylon wins. And Babylon goes in and they take young men from their homes, their homeland, from their families. Okay. And we're going to start out here in Daniel 1, and I'm going to read to you verses 6 through 13. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah were four of the young men chosen from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar. Hananiah was called Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshach. And Azariah was called Abednego. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. But he responded, I'm afraid, my lord, the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine, that if you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded. But Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water, Daniel said. At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see. So after the end of those 10 days, I'm just going to quickly wrap that up. They looked better than the other people, okay? So it was Daniel who was determined not to defile himself with the Babylonian food and wine. And it's Daniel that steps out in boldness. But here's the thing. In there, you hear that Daniel didn't just step out and ask for himself. He wasn't just concerned about his own spiritual well-being. He asked for his friends too. He asked for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as well, right? And here's the thing. I don't know how to wear this thing, apparently. I don't know how, I don't know why they didn't ask, right? And sometimes when I read the Bible, I'm trying to fill in the gaps. I wonder why things, the things that we don't necessarily know. So I wondered, why didn't they ask for themselves? Why didn't Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego ask? I know this much. I know human nature, and I know young kids. I, by profession, work with teenagers. And I know that they were probably intimidated. They had just witnessed war. They had witnessed their own homeland ravaged, people die, and all at the hands of this king. And so they were probably a little bit afraid, but Daniel knew that. And he, in boldness, stepped out and asked for his friends as well. Okay? So I also have to wonder, if Daniel's boldness didn't inspire them just a few verses later, few chapters later, and we'll read about that here in just a second. Um, just a few short years later, they are, um, we'll look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and see maybe if Daniel didn't inspire them a little bit. Um, One thing that I want to bring up is I did some research and I started looking, and there's no definitive answer in this, but historians believe that Daniel may have been about 14 when he was taken, and that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were between the ages of 11 and 13. So we're talking about a 13, 14-year-old kid in Daniel who goes and asks, "Hey, I don't want to have to follow your rules." He steps out in boldness and asks that for both he and his friends, right? So then in Daniel 3:15 through 18, we're going to go there in just a second. I'm going to set that up for you. Nebuchadnezzar at this point, King Nebuchadnezzar, the same king who is the one who has taken them from their home, the same one who's taken them from their home, the same one who's had all this, who has put them in these different places, insisted that they eat these things. Nebuchadnezzar at this point has decided to build a statue that he is going to require his entire country to bow down and worship. Everybody under his rule has to bow down and worship. And this statue's huge. I think it says I can't remember the number, so many cubits, and I looked that up to see what it was. It was 95 feet tall and 95 feet wide. It was huge. And so Nebuchadnezzar says that everybody has to do this. And then here is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We're going to look at that. Then Nebuchadnezzar, they don't do it the first time, and then somebody rats them out. And so then Nebuchadnezzar flies into a rage and orders that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or worship the gold statue I've set up? I'm going to give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I've made. And when you hear the sound of the musical instruments, you need to bow down. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue that you have set up." Now, that's a lot of faith. Remember, these kids were between 11 and 13 when they were taken from their home. The story happens about 3 years after that. So at that point, we're talking about kids who are between the ages of 14 and 16 maybe, and they are standing up to a powerful king who, if you don't know that story, I think sometimes we leave things off. He does throw them into a fiery furnace. And not only that, it's so hot that when they open the door, one of the guards just disintegrates. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have faith. They go in. They know God can rescue them. And Nebuchadnezzar sees 4 people as he's watching them walk through the furnace. So God rescues them. He rewards their faith. So I also have to wonder, guys, I tell you those stories, and yes, those men are young, but how did they know? How did Daniel know what was acceptable to eat and drink? How did he know what was acceptable to God? How did he know what would please God? And the only answer that I have for that is Daniel knew the law because someone along the way had invested in him. They had invested in him to teach him the law. They had invested in him to teach him what was acceptable to God, what was pleasing to God. Um, I've got a lot of scripture today, guys, so hang tight with me. We're going to move to 1 Samuel 17, and we're going to read verses 45 and 46. We're moving on to David, and we all know the story of David and Goliath, right? And remember, David's young. And here he is, and just to set that story up a little bit, he's on the battlefield. Grown men are cowering, right? And I happen to know a lot of grown men, and not one of them would ever say, nah, that guy, he can whip me. All grown men can whip anybody. But they were afraid of Goliath. And David, assumed to be about a 12-year-old boy, goes out and meets this giant on the battlefield. And David replied to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of the heavens armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Today the Lord will conquer you, and I will kill you and cut off your head. And then I will give the dead bodies of your men to the birds and wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel." It's a pretty bold claim for a 12-year-old boy. How did David come about that kind of faith? Somebody invested in him. Somebody invested in him along the way before he was out in those fields and learning those things. The Bible tells us in many places that we're supposed to invest in our children. In Deuteronomy 6 and 7, he says, "And you must commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these commandments that I'm giving you today. Repeat them again and again to your children. Talk about them when you're at home and when you're on the road and when you're going to bed and when you're getting up." We're supposed to continually teach our children. We're to invest in them. We're to teach them what's pleasing to God. If we look at Proverbs 22:6, direct your children onto the right path, and when they're older, they will not leave it. Guys, we see an example of that. Remember, I said earlier that Daniel was probably about 14 when he was taken. And do you know that when Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, he was probably between 70 and 80 years old? He never returned back home. He lived in Babylon that whole time. But he was invested in as a child, and that investment paid off. He continued on that path. He continued to have that faith. He continued to change a nation because somebody had invested in him when he was young. Guys, sometimes, and I really, this feels a little bit like a rabbit trail. I could not take it out. And I feel like a lot of us sitting in this room are in the same place. So I felt like I needed to say this. I oftentimes feel like, we talk about sharing our testimonies a lot. And I feel a lot of times like, I don't have much of a testimony. I was raised in a Christian home, and I'm thankful for that. But, from a really young age, I knew that I could trust Jesus, and I never really strayed very far from that. I mean, I might get a little bit over here, but when things started to get rough, I was like, oh yeah. Okay, over here, I need to trust Jesus again, right? Like, this is where I needed to be. Somebody had invested that in me, and I'm thankful for that. But I felt like maybe this testimony thing, like, what do I have to say? Right? Like, Andy shared his testimony a few weeks ago, and it was amazing, and God did an amazing transformative thing in his life. But for me, It's not that big of a transformation. But God said, wait a minute. I certainly used Paul. That was probably the biggest transformation story ever, right? He's on the road to Damascus. He goes blind. Jesus says, why are you persecuting me? Paul changes around. He's been killing Christians, and now he's trying to convert people to Christianity. Huge transformation story. But God also used David. He also used Daniel. He also used Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. He used Joseph. He used he used all kinds of people throughout the Bible, young people who were invested in at an early age. They didn't have these huge transformation stories, and he used them to be giants in the faith, just as Paul was a giant in the faith. So, invest in them. And it is not a shameful thing to not have a huge transformation story. That doesn't mean God can't use you. I want you guys to notice that also with all of those people I just mentioned, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel, David, Joseph, he didn't wait till those people were older, right? They didn't have to be adults for him to use them. He used them in their youth, which brings me to the point that our children, guys, are not the church of tomorrow. They're not the church of the future. They are the church of today. And I say that because I'm guilty. And I think all of us, if we're honest, have sometimes been guilty of thinking like, okay, let's get the kids downstairs to the babysitters so we can have real church up here. And I'm going to tell you that real church happens down there. Real church happened this week when a little girl who did not want to come to VBS and was scared out of her mind, who stayed the first night, who by the third or fourth night went downstairs, and she was in my group, and they said, who would like to pray before we have snack? And she raised her hand, and I promise you that child called heaven down. And they were talking about it downstairs for quite some time afterwards. And I was even asked about it on Friday night. Hey, who was that little girl that prayed? That was church. And they were having church. And I want to give you just a quick example of that. And I'm going to use Hunter, and I asked his permission to talk about him a little bit, but I'm using the story because it's what I know, but it's evidence of what I've seen. Hunter was in third, fourth grade, and his elementary school had an FCA. And I'm going to try to make it through this without crying. For those of you who don't know what FCA is, it's a Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and it's a club that's in a lot of schools. And they had a teacher there who was willing to sponsor it, and they met one day a week before school, and they would have Bible study, and they would pray. They would pray for their school, and they would pray for their teachers. And they got in the habit of writing staff members notes and saying, hey, I prayed for you today. Hey, FCA prayed for you today. Just want you to know we're thinking about you. We love you. We see how hard you're working, and we're praying for you. And Hunter's teacher, I ran into her the very next year. He was in third grade that year. And the very next year, I was out in a store somewhere, and I ran into her, and she said, I need to talk to you. And I said, okay. And she said, every school year, I don't believe kids are put in my class by accident, and I wonder what it is that they need from me. And I start looking at that, and I start looking for that. And she said, but last year was such a hard year for me. She said, I was going through a divorce. My youngest child had started college and moved away from home. She said, I was an empty nester. I was going through a divorce, and my dad was really ill, and I was his primary caretaker, and life had really begun to drag me down. She said, and every day when I thought I couldn't take any more, I would get, here would come Hunter with a little note that would say, hey, we prayed for you today in FCA. We're thinking about you. We love you. We see what you're doing. We see your hard work. And she said, it was then that I realized this kid wasn't in my class because he needed me to be anything to him. He was there because I needed him. God had placed that baby in that class because that teacher needed ministered to. And God does that with our children, and we see that. Guys, I'm friends with a lot of you guys on social media, and I won't we won't talk too much about social media, but friends with a lot of you on social media, and I hear the conversations in the lobby and outside, and we often get really scared about what the world looks like now and what that's going to look like for our kids. And I understand that fear. But here's the thing. God is not surprised by what's happening today. It doesn't shock him. Um, just like he wasn't surprised about what happened yesterday, and he's not going to be surprised about what happens 10 years from now and 15 years from now. And guys, just like he raised up a David and a Daniel and a Shadrach and a Meshach and an Abednego for such a time as that, he is raising up our children for such a time as this. But we have to invest in them. We have to make sure that they are ready. I grew up in a big church, a really big church, and I have to be really honest with you guys. Um, and I'm gonna pick on the worship team a little bit, not our worship team necessarily. It'll sound like that, but I remember thinking when I was a kid, their age, or when I was a kid, these guys' age, and seeing the people up on that stage every Sunday, and again, a big church, so it's kind of a bigger production too, right? And I thought, man, those guys are famous. Like they were somebody special. And then I would get up from church service and I would go to my Sunday school class, and there was sweet Miss K. And sweet Miss K, she was just a regular old person. She cut hair for a living, and she showed up on Sunday mornings and she wiped our nose if we needed it, and she, you know, told us our Bible stories and all of those things. But I think Miss K maybe knew a secret that I didn't know then. And that's that in Matthew 18, in verses 1 through 5, and I'm not going to read them, but the disciples are asking a question, and they're kind of, puffing out their chest a little bit and asking, like, hey, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Right? Is it going to be the famous people on the worship team? Is it going to be me? I'm a disciple, right? Is it going to be Chuck because he's the pastor? But instead, Jesus goes and gets a little child, and he brings him and sets him amongst the disciples. Children weren't often seen with adults in that time, and Jesus brings him over and sets him down and says, "I'm going to tell you truly that unless you can become like one of these, you can't even enter the kingdom of heaven." I think Miss Kay knew that. And then Jesus goes on to tell them that anyone who welcomes a child welcomes me. And I thought about that in terms of investment. Anybody who invests in a child is investing in Jesus. They're investing in the kingdom, right? We're investing in the kingdom. And here's the truth of the matter, guys. I don't remember any of those people's names that were up on that stage except the worship pastor. And he's still around, so I know him. But I don't remember any of those people, but I remember Miss Kay. And I'm so thankful that she invested in me. So how can we invest in our children here at New Hope? I have a couple of different ways that I want to talk about. One of those, and I'm going to pick on him a little bit. He's not here. But, Dakota Novak picks on my child, you guys. He picks on him all the time. Sometimes he even hurts him a little bit, but it's good for him. He needs that. He's an only child. But I have thanked Dakota for investing in my child. Now, he doesn't sit down and have Bible study with him, but Dakota's a godly man, a godly young man. And when he picks on my child, Hunter is so fond of Dakota. He loves him and he looks up to him and he wants to be just like him. And if my child's going to emulate somebody, I'm thankful it's a man like Dakota. And kids need that. They don't always need mom and dad to be the only influence. And so I'm thankful for a Dakota Novak. And we all have people in church that we can do that with. Um, Mom and dad, you can invest in your own children at home. Back in Deuteronomy, it says to, to tell them when you're at home and when you're on the road. And so my challenge to you is this: are we talking about it at home? Are we talking about what God wants at home? Are we talking about what pleases God at home? We can certainly volunteer for children's ministry. And there are lots of ways, guys, that you can get involved, right? We have Wednesday nights, we have Sunday mornings, and there are ladies who came at VBS. But here's the thing: we can't just invest in our children 1 week out of the year. It's got to be a full-time commitment to invest in them. And we had ladies who were down there and they were cooking and they were doing things for them. And they blessed those kids and ministered to those kids the same as the people who were the leaders and the same as Uncle Tim and Cousin Brandon. So, guys, that Tim and Brandon did our lessons for us every night and they were fantastic. But, you can invest by serving. And you might be saying, well, I don't speak so good. Yeah, well, neither did Moses, but God didn't stop God from using him. So no excuses there. And you also might be saying, it's just not really all that glamorous. And you would be 100% correct. There is not much glamour in it at all, but I promise you that it is worth it. And you might also be thinking that you're not qualified. But here's the deal. If we look back at that, Jesus said anyone who welcomes a child, anyone who invests in that child is investing in the kingdom. He did not put a qualifier on it. And I think we've all heard it say, he does not call the qualified, he qualifies the called. So, and he has called us all to invest in our children. And here's the thing, guys, the last thing, and we're going to do this here in just a minute, we can pray for our children. And they may not be your children, but we should be praying for the children in this church. They're going back to school. They're getting ready to head into their mission field. They're going to have their own community that they are ministering to. And we should be praying for them, just like we should be praying for our pastors and we should be praying for each other. We should also be praying for our children. Because here's the thing, guys. We have to invest in them and we have to continue to pray for them, because there is coming a time, and we're seeing it already, that the world is going to tell them to kneel. And we need to make sure that they know how to stand. So, guys, what I want us to do, if we could, is I would like to have, I want to say one more thing before we do this. Guys, I was so proud. Some of our middle schoolers came this week and they helped lead VBS groups. They have already picked up on ministering to the next generation. Service. They've already picked up on that idea of service and ministering to the next generation. And guys, we talked about Daniel, and I want to say this too, because sometimes I think older people feel like, well, I don't have much, but here I don't have much to offer anymore. But Daniel remember we talked back about that. Daniel was 80 years old when he went into the lion's den. So if you're not dead, God's not done. So, but before we dismiss here and have one last worship song, I want our kids, and let's just start with our youngest. And guys, I'm good with our middle schoolers and high schoolers. They are all getting ready to go back to school. And we need to make sure that we are praying for them to be prepared for such a time as this, that they are going out into their mission field. They're being the hands and feet of Jesus, and they are being the church. So guys, if you would come up, I'm going to ask the rest of the church then to come up behind them, and let's just pray over.
Thank you for joining us today. I hope through the service today that you were uplifted, encouraged, but also challenged. I hope that your heart was stirred. If you would like more information about our church, please check out our website or check us out on Facebook.